Welcome to my channel.
Whodunit was quiet, as it usually was when the wind came whipping down from the hills, rattling shutters and making the windows fog with condensation. PC Hamish Macbeth sat in his patrol car outside the Whodunit Hotel, watching the rain pool in the potholes of the high street. He had a thermos of coffee in hand, a box of shortbread within reach, and a fishing rod leaning lazily against the seat. He had planned to spend the morning poaching salmon, or at least convincing himself he would. But, as always, paperwork from headquarters had other ideas. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. Headquarters could wait. He had been thinking about two things: how good the shortbread would be with a splash of whiskey, and whether Towser would approve if he skipped a walk and just stared out at the loch instead. The dog, of course, sat beside him in the drizzle, shaking out droplets with a flick of his tail as if mocking the very idea of work. Then came the news that always ruined a perfectly lazy day. Someone had arrived in Whodunit. And not just anyone. She was a Sassenach, tall, blonde, and wrapped in fur that could have sheltered 3 villagers from a Highland winter. She had arrived in a black car that hummed like a bee on steroids, parking illegally outside the hotel as though the rules of Whodunit didn't apply to her. Already the locals were grumbling. Hamish sighed, sipping his coffee. Outsiders were never quiet, never polite, and always seemed to think that money bought charm. The woman strutted down the high street, consulting a phone as if she were tracking the exact moment each raindrop fell. She was clearly here to make some kind of impression, and Whodunit didn't suffer impressions quietly. By mid-morning, the peace was shattered entirely. Mrs. McLean, the postmistress, appeared at the hotel door, waving her hands in a combination of horror and gossip. "Hamish, you'd best come quick. There's been an accident." Hamish groaned. "An accident, eh? Tea spill, or did the Sassenach trip over a puddle again?" Mrs. McLean's eyes widened. It's worse than that, Hamish. She's dead. Right there under the Christmas tree in the hotel lobby." Hamish blinked. The rain outside seemed to slow, the wind holding its breath. Dead. Under the Christmas tree. Not just a minor bruise, not a sprained ankle, but properly dead. He pulled on his coat, grabbed Towser's leash, and trudged into the hotel, mentally adjusting his holiday plans. He could have spent the morning napping or fishing, but now he had a corpse to greet, and somewhere in Whodunit, the smell of scandal was already starting to simmer. The lobby was festooned with tinsel and baubles, the hotel staff frozen in various states of shock. And there, under the gaudy Christmas tree, lay the woman, her fur coat fanned out like a peacock's tail, her expression a mixture of surprise and indignation. Hamish squatted beside her, careful not to step on any ornaments, Towser sniffing her shoes with polite curiosity. "Well," Hamish muttered to himself, "this is going to ruin the day." And somehow, he already knew, the trouble had only just begun. Hamish straightened, brushing rain from his coat, and surveyed the lobby with a disinterested squint that fooled most outsiders into thinking he had no clue what he was looking at. Towser, ever the professional, circled the corpse once, sniffed, and gave a tiny approving wag of his tail, as if confirming that the situation was sufficiently serious for a dog's attention. Hamish crouched again, noting the victim's shoes, the peculiar angle of her hands, and the smudge of a slightly crushed mince pie under the tree. A careless observer might have assumed this was some bizarre Christmas accident, but Hamish knew better. There was intention here, subtle and precise, even if the outward display was almost comically festive. The hotel staff had gathered near the bar, whispering urgently among themselves. The hotel manager, a stout man with a permanent frown, was flapping like a startled hen. "Hamish, you must do something. I mean, this is a disaster. Right under the tree." His voice pitched higher with every word. Hamish nodded once, calmly, and murmured, "Aye, it's a problem, all right," letting the understatement hang in the air. The manager blinked at him, expecting more, and Hamish simply sipped his coffee, as if the body itself were a minor inconvenience to his morning routine. Before Hamish could get comfortable in his observations, the unmistakable roar of a car engine announced the arrival of authority. Big city authority. DCI Blair, red-faced and bristling like a man who had just swallowed a thunderstorm, stormed into the lobby with 2 uniformed officers in tow. He wore his overcoat stiffly, as though the weight of his own importance was a physical burden. "Macbeth!" he barked, pointing a finger that trembled with barely contained rage. What in heaven's name is going on here? This is an Englishwoman. A guest. And dead right under your nose. Explain yourself. Hamish, leaning against the reception desk with his coffee cup in one hand, let the words wash over him. Blair had always approached Whodunit with the conviction that the Highlands were merely an inconvenient backwater in the grand scheme of policing. Hamish, of course, knew Blair's grand scheme was usually a series of blunders wrapped in red tape. "Morning, sir," Hamish said mildly, setting his cup down with deliberate care. "Seems we have an unfortunate accident, that's all. Towser here agrees." The dog gave a respectful bark. Blair's eyes bulged. "This is not just an accident," Blair shouted. "It is a criminal matter of the highest priority. We need statements, evidence, forensic analysis, and someone needs to explain why you allowed this to happen." Hamish shrugged, slowly, purposefully. "I wasn't allowed, sir. I just found her same as you. Tea, scones, and shortbread will explain themselves better than I ever could." He picked up a packet of hotel biscuits, breaking one in half, and offered it to Towser, who accepted graciously. Blair's nostrils flared. You lazy, useless," he began, but Hamish had already wandered toward the lobby chairs, leaving Blair sputtering at the scene, while Blair barked orders, demanding the staff recount every detail and pointing dramatically at the corpse. Hamish quietly moved among the gathered villagers. Mrs. McLean, the postmistress, had positioned herself near the doorway, clutching her handbag with the air of someone holding not just valuables but village secrets. Hamish sat down beside her with an almost imperceptible creak of the chair. "Morning, Mrs. McLean," he murmured. "How's the Morning Post apart from the excitement?" "Oh, Hamish," she whispered urgently, leaning in. "I've never seen anything like this. Poor creature. That fur. That air." And she came in, all haughty, talking about her yacht and what she wanted done with the hotel bar for Christmas. Everyone's talking about her. Lord help us, she made half the village feel, well, small. She glanced over her shoulder nervously. And the hotel staff, well, they were terrified. Terrified. Hamish nodded sagely, chewing the corner of his lip. "Aye, and did anyone notice anything odd before?" He gestured toward the corpse. "Any quarrels, arguments, sudden changes in attitude?" Mrs. McLean considered. "Well, there was that man, the one from the estate, what's his name, Duncan? He was arguing with her about parking outside the loch. He looked cross, but Hamish, you know him, he's harmless enough." She wrung her hands, and the curry shop owner said she insisted on paying 3 times the normal price for the takeout she ordered yesterday. Ridiculous. But he didn't seem angry, just baffled. Hamish gave a slow nod, letting the information sink in. The big, obvious clues were rarely the ones that mattered. The petty irritations, the slight grudges, the way someone treated a Sassenach as though their mere existence were an insult. These were the real windows into motive. Blair, meanwhile, had cornered the manager and a few staff members, scribbling notes furiously, red face flaring with each answer. Every time Hamish walked past, Blair shot him a glare that could peel paint. Hamish returned the glances with calm, thoughtful disinterest, letting Blair grow louder and more frustrated by the second. The day continued in this fashion, a curious blend of chaos and stillness. Hamish wandered the high street, stopping briefly at the curry shop to sip tea and tease the owner about last night's weather. He noted the angles of windows, the delivery schedule, and who had come into the village in the past 48 hours. Each trivial observation fed a pattern only Hamish could see. Back at the hotel, Blair was interrogating every staff member as though shouting could compel the truth, while Hamish quietly reconstructed the victim's final hours. Her arrival, her demands, the interactions that had gone unnoticed, and the subtle insults that had likely enraged someone enough to kill. By afternoon, the village was buzzing. Word travelled fast in Whodunit, and by now every resident had a theory. Jealous lover, vengeful cousin, furious shopkeeper. Hamish, of course, ignored these outpourings, sipping coffee, observing body language, and noting contradictions. One thing was clear: the obvious suspect, the overworked porter who had been first on scene, was not the culprit. That much Hamish could tell without a single word from headquarters forensic experts. Towser nudged him, and Hamish followed the dog outside to the small garden behind the hotel. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the loch's surface rippled in the chill wind. Hamish considered the landscape, the positions of the buildings, and the comings and goings he had quietly watched all morning. Somewhere in those seemingly mundane details lay the motive, the opportunity, and the key to who had pushed the proud Sassenach to her final rest beneath the Christmas tree. Hamish returned inside, brushing rain from his coat, and allowed a small, secret smile. Blair was still loudly accusing the porter, the staff were nervous, and the villagers were gossiping furiously. Meanwhile, Hamish had the first pieces of the puzzle, collected quietly over tea and whispers. The game had begun, and the slow, lazy policeman was already 3 steps ahead of the loud, red-faced inspector. And somewhere, Hamish thought, as he poured himself another cup of coffee, the real troublemaker was smiling too, thinking that nobody in Whodunit would notice their cleverness. Little did they know, Hamish Macbeth noticed everything, especially what was not said. Hamish spent the late afternoon moving quietly through Whodunit, letting the drizzle cling to his coat while Towser padded beside him, ears flicking at every distant sound. The village seemed caught between panic and curiosity. Doors opened just a crack, heads peered out, and whispers floated like smoke through the damp air. He had already spoken with most of the hotel staff, the postmistress, and even the curry shop owner, picking up scraps of conversation that, when assembled, hinted at tensions no one outside Whodunit would suspect. And now, as the shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, he found himself standing outside the Halberton Smythe estate, debating whether it was polite or dangerous to call. Elspeth Grant, who often doubled as confidant, critic, and occasional tormentor of his idle habits, appeared at the doorway almost the moment he decided to knock. She was carrying a tray with a steaming mug, which she offered with a look that clearly said, "I'm annoyed that I had to interrupt my own tea, but you're welcome anyway." Hamish accepted, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. "Trouble seems to be finding its way to the hotel," she said mildly, setting down the tray. "And it appears, as usual, that you're the only one aware it exists." He shrugged, letting Towser sit politely at his feet, though the dog's eyes betrayed curiosity for the warmth of the kitchen fire. "Aye, someone's dead. And while Blair makes a scene, the village talks, and the rain falls, I prefer to collect the little truths people leave lying around." He sipped the tea, grimaced at the overly sweet sugar, and frowned slightly. "Though I must admit, this one, she had a way of making people feel small." Elspeth raised an eyebrow. "Small?" "Hamish. She was insufferable. Loud, commanding, expensive-looking. Half the village probably dreamed of seeing her humbled, and now they have." Her voice softened. "But it's awful, of course. Someone pushed her, or worse." She looked at him sharply. "You've been observing?" He nodded once. "Aye. Odd little things. People's moods, their hesitations, what they didn't say." He leaned against the doorframe, carefully studying her expression. "Take the porter, for instance. First on the scene, red as a beet, hands trembling. The obvious suspect for Blair, yet his manner before the incident was hesitant, anxious in a way that suggested he feared trouble rather than caused it." Elspeth tilted her head, listening intently. "So the big loud man from Strathbane is barking up the wrong tree again?" Hamish allowed himself a small inward grin. As usual, Blair's confidence makes him blind. He sees what he wants, immediate guilt, and he shouts until everyone bends to it. Meanwhile, I watch, listen, and the truth, as it often does, creeps up quietly. The conversation turned toward the Sassenach, and the threads of her final hours began to appear in Hamish's mind like patches in a quilt. She had arrived on the previous evening, demanding special accommodations at the hotel, commenting scornfully on the village's slow pace, and insisting she would spend Christmas here only because it was quaint. Hamish had noted the tiny slights, the conversations cut short, the villagers' forced smiles, jealousies, resentments, and small, private humiliations had been simmering long before the fur-clad woman met the Christmas tree. Towser nudged Hamish, alerting him to movement beyond the kitchen window. He looked up to see Duncan McCrae, the estate manager who had exchanged words with the woman about parking and property access, pausing near the garden gate. His expression was awkward, brows furrowed. Hamish's gut told him Duncan was a participant in the drama, but likely not the perpetrator. The man's anger was open, natural, and fleeting, a contrast to the controlled, simmering rage Hamish suspected lay behind the real crime. Did anyone else visit her? Elspeth asked, pouring more tea. Friends, acquaintances, a family, perhaps? Hamish leaned on the counter, considering. Not that I can tell. She had an air of being self-contained. But self-contained people leave little footprints, and the small irritations, they're clues. A late payment for the curry, arguments about parking, complaints about the hotel staff. It's petty, Hamish, but these little things often reveal what bigger things someone might do when pushed. Elspeth frowned thoughtfully. So the killer isn't obvious. It's someone quiet, underestimated, or simply invisible until now. Exactly, Hamish said, finishing the tea and setting the mug down. And the beauty is, they've already revealed themselves in ways Blair will never see. Not until it's too late. He left the Halberton Smythe estate and wandered the village streets again, Towser padding silently behind. The early evening brought a chill that cut through even the thickest coat, and the mountains surrounding Whodunit faded into a misty grey, their peaks lost to clouds. Shops were closing, and the remaining villagers lingered near the hotel, gossiping, speculating, and sneaking glances at the place where the Sassenach had met her end. Hamish observed each face, noting twitches, hesitations, and furtive glances. Someone was hiding something, someone who appeared calm, helpful, and ordinary. At the hotel, Blair had grown increasingly frantic. He was pacing the lobby, shouting at staff and visitors alike, "No, no, that can't be right." The porter admits he was near the tree. Arrest him at once. Hamish, standing quietly by the coat rack with Towser, shook his head slightly. He had seen the porter's movements, the way he had tried to protect a tray of mince pies rather than tamper with the victim. Blair's logic was as thin as the fog settling over the loch outside. Hamish wandered behind the reception desk and leaned against the wood, listening carefully. A maid whispered about missing parcels. Another spoke of a curious remark the victim had made regarding a local fisherman who had refused to sell her a rare catch. None of these were obvious clues, but Hamish's mind worked quietly, piecing together how a seemingly petty insult could escalate to murder when pride, jealousy, and opportunity combined. By the time night fell, Hamish had a list of possible suspects, each defined by small slights and hidden grudges. The porter, Duncan McCrae, the curry shop owner, and even the anxious maid were all possibilities, but none fit the profile completely. He understood now what Blair could not. The killer's motive was human and small, not grandiose. Pride wounded, a social slight, a need to assert dominance. This was Whodunit, after all, where the most serious crimes were committed in whispers, not headlines. Hamish returned to the lobby, letting Towser settle beside the fire. Blair was still shouting, still red-faced, still convinced of the porter's guilt. The villagers had retired behind closed doors, leaving only the hotel staff and the faint hum of electric lights to illuminate the tree under which the victim had lain. Hamish poured himself another cup of coffee, noting the angles of shadows, the placement of ornaments, and the tiny disturbances in the dust that marked where furniture had been shifted. And somewhere in that quiet, observant routine, Hamish felt the faint thrill of the chase. Not the chase Blair sought, loud and dramatic and obvious. No, this was subtler, more satisfying. The kind that required patience, observation, and a willingness to look where no one else dared. And as the wind rattled the windows and the loch mirrored the grey sky above, Hamish knew the truth was close, so close he could almost taste it, like the faint tang of salt in the air. For now, though, he sipped his coffee, Towser at his side, letting the world believe he was idle, lazy, and slow. The real work, as always, would be done quietly, carefully, and without anyone noticing, until the killer made the mistake of thinking Hamish Macbeth wasn't paying attention. Hamish spent the following morning wandering the streets of Whodunit, under a sky, the colour of wet wool, the wind driving raindrops sideways across his face and into the collar of his coat. Towser trotted dutifully beside him, occasionally pausing to sniff the edge of a gutter or a suspicious patch of mud. The village was quieter than usual, as though everyone feared saying something aloud that might betray their involvement or knowledge. Hamish, as ever, let the silence do the work for him. Most people in Whodunit spoke too much or too little, and the careful balance between the two often revealed far more than any confessions could. He began at the hotel, moving around the lobby with casual attention, stopping only to nod at the staff, who were still tense and jumpy from the previous day's events. Blair was absent for the moment, presumably at the station dictating a furious report to Strathbane. no doubt blaming the porter and cursing the ineptitude of local policing. Hamish allowed himself a small, private smile. Blair never noticed that the quiet ones always saw more. He walked slowly past the Christmas tree, Towser sniffing the edge of the carpet, and crouched briefly to examine the ornaments. One had a tiny smudge of red, a crumb of something, or a drop of tea that no one else would have thought significant. Hamish made a mental note. Small things were often the pieces that built the whole picture. The porter, James MacGregor, was sweeping the hallway with the sort of nervous energy that suggested he hoped the task might somehow erase yesterday's horror. Hamish approached him casually, leaning against the wall with Towser's head resting on his boot. "Morning, James," he said quietly. "How are you holding up?" James jumped slightly, and the broom nearly slipped from his hands. I'm fine, PC Macbeth. Just trying to keep things tidy, you know." He glanced toward the tree, then back at Hamish. I didn't touch anything, I swear." Hamish inclined his head, slow and deliberate. I know that. "You were first on the scene. Terribly upsetting, I imagine. But tell me, did you notice anyone acting oddly yesterday?" James hesitated, brushing a hand across his brow. "Well, there was that woman, the hotel guest who came in with the Sassenach. She was strange. Kept asking about who had keys to the rooms, and she looked at me funny when I couldn't answer immediately. But I didn't." He stopped, glancing toward the lobby door nervously. "I didn't do anything wrong, I swear." Hamish nodded, eyes narrowing just slightly. The porter was honest enough in his nervousness, but he also offered a small clue without realizing it. Someone else had been moving about the hotel, someone subtle. The stranger James had mentioned was invisible to Blair, but not to Hamish. He made a mental note to follow up with the mysterious guest, though discretion was key. Outside, the streets glistened with residual rain. Hamish walked past the little shops, stopping to exchange a few words with the curry shop owner, who was sweeping the front steps and muttering about the price of imported spices. "Morning, Mr. Singh," Hamish said casually. "Busy day yesterday? Busy?" Singh snorted, brushing dust from his hands. "Busy is..." When the Sassenach stormed in demanding her curry before it was ready, insisted on paying triple, and then tipped nothing. But no, busy is not the word. Annoyed, maybe. He shook his head. And now she's dead, and the village is full of whispers. Terrible business. Hamish's mind worked quietly, sorting through the layers of irritation, entitlement, and human vanity. The woman had ruffled feathers everywhere she went, but not everyone who felt affronted had the courage, or the motive, to act in murder. He thanked Singh and moved along, eyes scanning for anyone who seemed out of place or whose casual friendliness masked something sharper. He paused at the small bridge over the stream, water rushing beneath, reflecting the grey sky in shimmering streaks. A figure approached, moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested both confidence and a desire to be overlooked. Duncan McCrae. Hamish greeted him, and they exchanged polite nods. But inwardly, Hamish assessed every twitch of the jaw, every shift of weight. Duncan was capable of irritation, certainly, but anger alone was rarely enough to propel someone to murder. Hamish noted the neatness of Duncan's clothing, the careful way his coat avoided the rain, and the subtle tension in his shoulders. Something about the man was not quite in line with the surface story. Back at the hotel, the investigation had resumed. Blair had returned, face redder than a boiled lobster, and voice carrying authority meant to intimidate. He was cornering the staff again, waving his hands and proclaiming that the investigation's solution was obvious. The porter, James MacGregor. Hamish, leaning against the hallway wall with Towser at his side, watched the scene unfold. Blair's logic was as loud as it was flawed, a perfect foil for Hamish's quiet patience. Then a breakthrough came in the form of a small, seemingly insignificant detail. A bellboy whispered to Hamish that he had seen one of the hotel's seasonal decorations. A small velvet stocking move overnight, not in the usual way of someone adjusting the tree, but as if someone had retrieved something from it. Hamish crouched, inspecting the stocking and noting faint scratches along the hem. It was small, barely perceptible, but it told a story. Someone had hidden or retrieved something under the Christmas tree, possibly the same item that had contributed to the victim's final moments. Hamish's thoughts turned inward, connecting dots in the pattern only he could perceive. The Sassenach had been assertive, controlling, demanding. Someone, patient and precise, had seen an opportunity in her predictable arrogance. They had acted quietly, leaving a trail no one in Blair's loud, impatient methodology would follow. The porter's obvious presence was a convenient distraction, and the hotel staff, nervous and polite, had inadvertently preserved clues without realizing it. By late afternoon, Hamish had mapped the movements of every key person present: the hotel staff, the villagers who had been near the hotel, and those who had visited the Sassenach during her short stay. Patterns emerged not in the glaring drama Blair pursued, but in whispers, pauses, and micro-moments. Moments that revealed irritation, jealousy, and opportunity. A misplaced package here, a casual remark there, a stolen glance that lingered too long. All pointed to someone calm, underestimated, and watching from the shadows. Towser nudged Hamish, alerting him to a presence behind the reception desk. A young maid appeared, wringing her hands and looking guilty. Though her eyes darted at Blair, who was still shouting about the porter, Hamish leaned forward, speaking softly, so only she could hear. "You've seen something, something small that nobody noticed." The maid hesitated, then nodded slightly. I didn't think it mattered. She asked for a package to be moved, said it was very important, then went to the lobby, and that's when..." Her voice trailed off. Hamish nodded, sensing the hesitation, the fear, and the crucial truth she hadn't said aloud. It fit neatly with the scratches in the stocking, the minor disturbances, and the pattern of the Sassenach's interactions. Hamish stepped back, letting Towser circle once, as if confirming that the world was still in proper order. Blair bellowed something about confessions, but Hamish ignored him, allowing the inspector's own noise to obscure the first real pieces of the puzzle, forming quietly in his mind. The truth was near, though hidden under layers of social pretense, pride, and minor annoyances. Hamish knew the next steps would require patience, cunning, and a delicate manipulation of the village's gossip, something Blair could never manage. As evening fell over Whodunit, the rain returned in a persistent drizzle, washing the cobblestones and blurring the distant lights along the loch. Hamish sipped his coffee, Towser at his feet, and let the village calm settle around him. Somewhere in the shadows, the killer was confident, believing their cleverness would go unnoticed. Hamish, however, felt the quiet satisfaction of anticipation. The mistake that would reveal them was coming, and he intended to be there, watching, listening, and waiting with the patience only a Highland policeman could summon. Hamish spent the next morning in a haze of fog and drizzle that rolled off the mountains like a living thing. The loch mirrored the grey sky, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface, and the village remained subdued, as if it too were contemplating the strange events of the past day. Towser padded beside him, ears alert for sounds humans often missed, and Hamish allowed himself the luxury of a slow walk, knowing that observation required patience more than haste. Inside the hotel, Blair was already at full volume, gesticulating as a man possessed, and the staff had begun to settle into a state of nervous compliance. Hamish leaned against a doorway, coffee in hand, listening to Blair bark questions at the porter. "You were near the tree, you saw nothing, you must have seen something, tell me now." The porter, red-faced and shaking, repeated his account for what must have been the third time. Hamish shook his head almost imperceptibly. The truth was never so loud. It was then that Hamish noticed something odd. The little velvet stocking, which he had examined the day before, was slightly out of place again. The hem had been brushed, not accidentally, but deliberately. A faint smear of something, coffee or perhaps cocoa from the hotel cafe, clung to the fabric. Hamish crouched, noting the angle of the stocking, the way it had been shifted, and the tiny fingerprint he could see if he squinted just right. The person who had moved it had been careful, precise, and unaware that someone was already watching. He moved quietly toward the maid who had spoken to him the previous evening, her hands trembling as she cleaned the reception desk. "Did anyone else handle this?" he asked softly. Her eyes flicked toward Blair and then back to him. I don't know," she admitted. "The lady... She received a small parcel yesterday. She was very particular about it. I carried it to her, but I didn't touch it after that." Hamish nodded slowly. "Aye, and the parcel... Any idea what it was?" The maid hesitated, wringing her hands. "I think it was some kind of fabric. Expensive, delicate..." She said it was very important. She looked at him, clearly trying to decide whether honesty might get her into trouble. I think someone wanted it, but I didn't see who. Hamish let the information settle. It was small, seemingly trivial, yet it fit into the pattern he had begun to see. The victim had been demanding, controlling, and arrogant, which meant anyone who approached her, if they felt wronged, insulted, or simply tired of her airs, might take the opportunity. But this was no random act of rage. The careful removal or retrieval of a parcel suggested planning, subtlety, and knowledge of the hotel's routines. The obvious suspects, including the porter and Duncan McRae, were too transparent in their movements. The real culprit was someone invisible in plain sight, someone underestimated by both the village and Blair. Hamish wandered the lobby, Towser brushing against his legs, and spoke quietly to the receptionist, noting deliveries, guests, and anyone who had entered the hotel unannounced. Each name, each passing comment was another stitch in the tapestry of motive and opportunity. The Sassenach had not only demanded attention, but had inadvertently revealed the weaknesses and ambitions of those around her. One wrong word, one careless gesture, and someone had acted. The question was who and why. By late morning, he found himself at the small cafe near the loch, sipping tea and watching the villagers move about their routines. Blair had stationed himself at the hotel, confident that the case would collapse into a neat, arrestable narrative, but Hamish had already discarded the obvious solution. He watched the Fishers, the postmistress, the curry shop owner, and the Halberton Smythe estate staff, noting each hesitation, each glance, each subtle sign of discomfort. The killer's nature was human, petty, and precise, not grandiose, and Hamish knew the mind that could plan such an act with such quiet cunning would also be the kind that appeared, helpful or invisible, the sort one would never suspect. Toward midday, a minor incident provided a breakthrough. The maid, cleaning near the lobby window, noticed a smudge on a ledge where the parcel had been placed the previous day. Hamish examined it carefully and found a trace of perfume. Subtle, floral, unmistakably expensive. It was not the Sassenach's scent. Someone else had been there, lingering close enough to move the parcel, possibly in the very moment she met her end. The evidence was slight, nearly imperceptible, but it confirmed what Hamish had suspected. The killer had acted with calm precision, leaving minor clues that only a patient observer could assemble. Hamish returned to the porter, speaking quietly so Blair could not hear over his furious dictation to the station. "James, think carefully. Was there anyone in the lobby yesterday who seemed polite, helpful, but maybe a little too attentive? Someone who offered to assist with packages or check the tree?" The porter blinked, uncertain. "Well, there was Miss Forbes, the housekeeper. She always moves quickly, never draws attention, and she often helps guests with their belongings. But He stopped, glancing nervously toward Blair, who was still shouting, oblivious. Hamish nodded slowly. Thank you, that's useful." Inside, he noted how invisible the pattern of the killer's movements had been, polite, diligent, and almost self-effacing, yet always present, always observing, always in position to act. Blair would never see it, but Hamish did. He sipped his coffee, letting the realization settle. The so-called red herring, the obvious suspect that Blair was preparing to arrest, was simply a convenient decoy. The real perpetrator had worked under the radar, leveraging human psychology, timing, and the victim's arrogance to commit the act and appear blameless. Even as the afternoon light dimmed, Hamish continued to assemble the fragments, the parcel, the stocking, the perfume, and the subtle movements of the maid. All pointed towards someone who had motive, not for wealth, not for revenge in any dramatic sense, but for a small personal satisfaction. Perhaps a sense of superiority, a desire to assert control, or a quiet vengeance for a minor insult inflicted by the Sassenach's arrogance. The killer had relied on the village's assumptions, Blair's impatience, and the chaotic facade of emotion to mask their careful planning. Towser nudged Hamish again, signalling that it was time to return to the hotel. The wind picked up outside, driving sheets of rain against the windows, and the loch reflected the grey, shifting clouds as if mirroring the tension in the air. Blair was still at the reception desk, red-faced and ranting, and the porter was fidgeting with his broom, caught between fear and relief that his own innocence might finally be recognized. Hamish leaned against a wall, taking another slow sip of coffee, and allowed a small smile to cross his face. The trap was forming in his mind, subtle and clever, designed to draw out the killer without them realizing it. In the quiet, observing way that had served him so well for years, Hamish felt the pieces begin to align. The invisible threads of motive, opportunity, and human pride were coming together, and the misdirection Blair relied upon would crumble at the precise moment he chose. Somewhere, the real killer walked free, confident in their cunning, unaware that Hamish Macbeth had already begun setting the stage. And as the evening descended upon Whodunit, with the wind moaning around corners and the last of the villagers retreating indoors, Hamish sipped his coffee, Towser at his side, knowing that patience, observation, and subtle cunning would soon reveal the truth. The following morning dawned pale and grey, with the kind of drizzle that made the cobblestones shine slick and dark, and the mountains above Whodunit veiled in mist. Hamish wrapped his coat tightly around him and let Towser lead the way through the village streets, eyes flicking to shop windows, doors, and any movement in alleyways. The Sassenach's death had transformed the village into a nervous ecosystem. Every glance, every hesitant step could be a clue. Blair had returned, already bellowing into a phone as if Strathbane itself would collapse under his righteous fury, leaving the local policing completely out of the question. Hamish lingered near the hotel, where the staff moved cautiously, conscious of every footstep. The stockings, the parcel, the small smudge of perfume, these details persisted in his mind. A constellation of quiet hints that, once connected, might illuminate the culprit. Blair, meanwhile, was already focused on the red herring, the porter, James MacGregor. Hamish had long since discarded that notion, and he let Blair rage and shout, satisfied that the inspector's mistakes would only make the real solution easier to unveil. As the morning wore on, Hamish began the subtle work of setting his own trap, weaving it into the fabric of village life as naturally as the morning mist. He moved through the high street casually, greeting shopkeepers and stopping for brief chats over tea and coffee. Each conversation was deliberate. He mentioned the Sassenach's behaviour in passing, noted the missing parcel, and dropped hints about the stocking under the Christmas tree. To the casual observer, he appeared idle, drinking coffee, and distracted by Towser's sudden interest in passing leaves. But each word, each gesture, was calculated to provoke reactions in those who had more to hide. At the curry shop, he lingered longer than usual, teasing Mr. Singh about the quality of his new spice shipment. "I hear there's been quite the stir over at the hotel," Hamish said casually, stirring sugar into his tea. "A parcel misplaced, a stocking out of line. Curious, isn't it? How the little things can unsettle the best-laid plans." Singh's eyes narrowed, but he merely shrugged, mumbling about customers and deliveries. Hamish noted the hesitation, the slight flinch, the way Singh's hand brushed unconsciously over the counter. It was nothing decisive, but it added to the pattern forming in Hamish's mind. Next he strolled toward the Halberton Smythe estate, where he found Elspeth tending to the small winter garden. She looked up at him with the hint of a smile that suggested amusement at his pretense of laziness. "Still plotting, Hamish?" she asked. "Or just enjoying the drizzle?" "Plotting mostly," he said, letting Towser sniff at the flower beds. "Little tests, quiet ones, people, reveal themselves when they think nobody's paying attention." He leaned on the gate, watching her carefully. Curious what people will do to maintain appearances. Sometimes it takes a simple remark to see who's telling the truth and who's hiding behind politeness. Elspeth tilted her head thoughtfully. "And have you discovered anyone yet?" "Possibly, but patience is needed. The clever ones are cautious, and they think themselves invisible. That's where mistakes happen, when they believe no one is watching." He sipped his coffee, allowing the words to hang. Towser let out a small bark as if agreeing with the sentiment. By midday, Hamish had returned to the hotel and begun his most subtle manoeuvre, letting it be known, in casual, distracted remarks to staff and villagers alike, that he was investigating minor discrepancies, paying attention to packages, stockings, and ornaments. He spoke to the housekeeper, to the maid, and even the receptionist, letting phrases slip like, "Oh, that stocking seems slightly out of place again," or "Curious, isn't it? How the perfume lingers where it shouldn't." Each comment was innocent in tone, casual enough to avoid suspicion, yet it stirred anxiety in those with something to conceal. It did not take long. By mid-afternoon, he noticed the housekeeper, Miss Forbes, glancing nervously toward the Christmas tree, hands twitching as if she had something to adjust or hide. Her movements were careful, deliberate, and almost exaggerated in their casualness, a classic sign of someone overcompensating under scrutiny. Hamish approached, letting Towser sniff at her boots as a natural pretext. "Miss Forbes," he said softly, "it's a busy day, isn't it? Lots to attend to. You've been diligent. I hope nothing's troubling you." Her eyes flicked to the tree, then back at him, a slight paleness creeping into her complexion. She shook her head, murmuring, "No, nothing at all, PC Macbeth." Hamish nodded, though his gaze lingered. The delicate balance of composure and anxiety told him what words could not. She had been near the parcel, near the stocking, and she had acted quietly, carefully. Yet she had believed she left no trace. In a village like Whodunit, careful observation revealed more than confession ever could. Blair, meanwhile, continued his performance in the lobby, waving his arms at the porter and gesturing as if volume could summon truth. Hamish let him rage, satisfied. Blair's insistence on the obvious suspect provided cover for his own manoeuvring. Soon, the real culprit would act again, compelled by their need to maintain appearances or remove evidence. And Hamish would be ready, quietly observing, catching the slip that would expose them. Toward evening, Hamish wandered again, letting the village seem as though he had little concern, sipping coffee, stopping briefly to exchange a word with the postmistress, noting her subtle shifts in tone. The weather had intensified, wind gusted off the loch, and rain lashed against windows. The dramatic setting seemed almost theatrical, yet Hamish welcomed it. Storms, like tension, had a way of revealing true character. As he returned to the hotel, he noticed Miss Forbes adjusting the Christmas tree ornaments with extra care. A faint smudge of perfume clung to her sleeve, overlooked in her meticulous movements. Hamish crouched slightly, pretending to examine a window latch. Towser gave a low, expectant growl. Hamish understood the trap was nearly ready. The killer's own perfectionism, their attempts to cover tracks, and the delicate manipulation of daily routines would betray them. They only needed to act again, and their guilt would slip through the cracks of their careful facade. Hamish allowed himself a small, private grin. Blair would continue to shout at shadows and obvious suspects, the villagers would gossip and speculate, and the housekeeper would unknowingly signal her own role. Patience, subtlety, and observation were his tools. And as the loch darkened beneath a shroud of storm clouds, and the village lights flickered in damp windows, Hamish knew the critical moment was near. The careful, polite, invisible person who had thought themselves beyond suspicion was about to make the first revealing mistake. And Hamish Macbeth would be watching, quietly, with a mind 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The next morning arrived grey and brittle, with a wind that tugged insistently at coats and umbrellas, and the loch rippling in restless silver under the clouds. Hamish moved through the village streets at his usual leisurely pace, coffee thermos in hand, Towser padding quietly at his side, ears alert to every faint sound. The hotel had begun to settle into a tense rhythm, staff moving carefully, aware that the Sassenach's death had left a subtle mark on their routines. Blair, predictably, was still focused on the porter, James MacGregor, convinced that the case would resolve neatly once he secured a confession. Hamish, however, knew better. The truth was quieter, hidden in the minor irritations and understated movements of those who felt themselves invisible. Inside the hotel lobby, Hamish wandered past Blair, who was red-faced and flailing, dictating furious instructions to the staff. "No, that cannot be. You saw nothing, James? Nothing at all? This is incompetence," Blair barked, pointing in all directions at once, while Hamish leaned casually against a doorway, Towser at his feet. He sipped coffee, noting the glances between staff members, the flicker of hesitation in their eyes, the tiny tremor in their hands that tried to appear steady. People who acted innocently often revealed themselves through overcompensation, and Hamish had learned long ago to watch the quiet signs. It was the housekeeper, Miss Forbes, who provided the first real breakthrough. She had been going about her duties with a careful precision, adjusting ornaments, checking the stockings and straightening chairs, yet her glances toward the Christmas tree had a subtle edge. Hamish approached her casually, leaning on the banister near the lobby staircase. "Miss Forbes," he said softly, "you've been busy, aye? Lots to attend to today. Everything in order, I hope?" Her hands froze mid-adjustment of a garland, and she swallowed, a tiny tremor betraying her composure. "Yes, everything, PC Macbeth, all in order." Her voice was steady enough, but her eyes flicked to the stockings, the parcel, and finally back to Hamish. "That's good," he said mildly. "It's a busy day for all of us. These little details, they tend to slip past attention, don't they? Things that might not seem important at first, but later, well, they're quite telling." He let his gaze drift casually toward the tree. Towser sniffed at her boots, giving a small, approving grunt, and she flinched slightly. Hamish noted it without comment. The subtle slip, the twitch of a hand, the avoidance of eye contact, the faint perfume scent on her sleeve, was all he needed. He had suspected the real culprit had been acting invisible, polite, and helpful, a figure underestimated by both the village and Blair. Miss Forbes's careful overcompensation confirmed it. She had moved the parcel, adjusted the stocking, and maintained her air of calm, confident that no one noticed. Hamish allowed a slight pause, as if considering something else entirely. Then, in the casual tone of one remarking on the weather, he mentioned aloud, "Funny, isn't it, how sometimes the smallest items, like a little stocking or a parcel, can make the biggest difference. One misplaced thing, and suddenly everyone's assumptions are, well, rather misleading." He sipped his coffee, watching her reaction carefully. "Miss Forbes's—" Hands shook slightly. She glanced around the lobby, ensuring Blair was still occupied with James, and Hamish leaned closer. "You've seen something, haven't you? Something that seemed minor at first, but mattered more than anyone realized." She swallowed again, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean, she irritated me. She looked down on everyone, said we were slow, incompetent, inferior. I only wanted to make her pay for the way she treated us. I didn't think." Her words faltered, guilt threading through her tone. Hamish nodded, letting the confession linger, unforced. "Aye, and the parcel?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I moved it. She had been very insistent about it, saying it was precious. I wanted her to be uncomfortable, just a little. But I didn't intend for her to—" She trailed off, the unspoken truth filling the space. Hamish allowed a long pause, sipping his coffee again. Towser sat quietly, watching her, as if acknowledging that she had already revealed too much without realizing it. The housekeeper's careful, polite demeanour had masked both motive and action until the slightest prod, a comment, a glance, a patient observer, exposed her hand. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, the loch beneath the grey sky tossing small waves against the shore. Blair was still shouting, still convinced of the porter's guilt, still missing the real story that had unfolded under his nose. Hamish, however, had every detail assembled. The Sassenach's death had not been about grand robbery, vengeance, or passion. It had been petty, human, and quiet. Pride, irritation, and the desire to assert control had driven Miss Forbes to act. The parcel, the stocking, the small corrections of the victim's behaviour, all were pieces of her carefully constructed plan. Hamish let her continue, nodding slowly, not interrupting. People often said more when they believed no one understood the full context. Eventually she admitted the precise details, how she had approached the tree when the Sassenach was distracted, how she had moved the parcel slightly to provoke a reaction, and the exact moment when her manipulation had unintentionally caused the fatal slip. Every tiny action had been deliberate in intention, accidental in consequence. Towser nudged Hamish, sensing the shift in atmosphere, and Hamish allowed himself a small, private grin. Blair was still furious elsewhere, unaware that the first solid piece of evidence confirming the true culprit's identity was now laid bare before Hamish. The red herring, James MacGregor, remained in place for Blair's theatrics, while the real perpetrator had unwittingly confessed through their own nervous, careful actions. Hamish stepped back, letting Miss Forbes regain composure, his tone casual as if commenting on something mundane. "Aye, well, People do strange things when they think they're unseen. Best we all remember that, aye? She nodded, relief mingling with residual guilt, though she did not speak further. Hamish allowed her a moment before turning to Towser, whose quiet understanding seemed to communicate. All in a day's work, Hamish. Blair, oblivious and loud, continued his assault on the porter, but Hamish knew the truth. The killer's identity, hidden under layers of politeness and routine, had been exposed, and the pieces could now be assembled into a coherent story without Blair ever recognizing the method. The trap had worked. Subtle manipulation, casual observation, and a patient eye had revealed what forceful interrogation could never uncover. As evening descended over Whodunit, the wind rattled the village shutters, rain tapped on the windows, and the loch reflected the darkening clouds. Hamish sipped his coffee, Towser curled at his feet, and allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of progress. The motive, the opportunity, and the sequence of actions now lay before him with crystal clarity. Blair would take the credit, of course, the village would gossip endlessly. But Hamish's careful orchestration had achieved exactly what he intended: the truth discovered, justice prepared, and his position in Whodunit secure. And somewhere in the shadows, the realization would soon settle in for Miss Forbes that Hamish Macbeth was not as idle, slow, or indifferent as he appeared. Every detail mattered, every small movement was observed, and the day would come when those tiny truths would be revealed, precisely when Hamish chose. The morning air over Whodunit was crisp and carried a faint tang of salt from the loch, the kind that made one feel awake even before a proper cup of coffee. Hamish walked slowly through the village streets, Towser padding faithfully at his side, ears flicking at every faint sound, a shutter rattling, the distant cough of a fisher, the quick steps of someone trying not to be noticed. The housekeeper, Miss Forbes, had been careful yesterday, but Hamish knew human nature too well. Subtle nerves and pride often betrayed the cleverest plans. He had observed, probed, and waited, and now it was time to see the threads of her own anxiety lead her into revealing more than she intended. Blair had retreated to the hotel, dictating reports to Strathbane with a ferocity that suggested the case had already reached a dramatic conclusion, in his mind at least. The porter, James MacGregor, continued to sweat under Blair's loud scrutiny, though he had long since told the truth. Hamish leaned casually against the stone wall of the hotel, coffee in hand, letting the red-faced inspector continue his performance. In the quiet, observant way that had always served him well, Hamish was already piecing together the next move, a subtle trap, gentle enough that Miss Forbes wouldn't suspect it, yet designed to provoke the slip that would confirm her culpability. He began by letting small, carefully chosen remarks filter through the hotel staff. To the maid, he mentioned, casually, that he had noticed the stocking at the tree had been slightly adjusted overnight. To the receptionist, he murmured about the lingering perfume on a misplaced package. To Towser, he whispered low praise for his keen nose, letting the dog's quiet presence encourage attention to minor details. Each comment seemed innocuous, but for someone conscious of their own concealment, the anxiety these remarks produced could be powerful. By midday, Hamish had positioned himself in the hotel lobby with an air of idle observation, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the room with Towser at his feet. Miss Forbes moved about her duties with unusual care, adjusting chairs and ornaments with an extra flourish that betrayed tension beneath her otherwise diligent manner. Hamish's gaze lingered on her, noting every small hesitation, the faint tremor in her hands, the glance toward the Christmas tree. She was aware that he knew more than he let on, yet she believed herself calm, rational, and invisible. "Busy day, isn't it?" he said casually as he sipped coffee. Towser gave a small grunt of agreement. So many little details to manage. One misstep, and the whole morning seems unsettled. His tone was innocuous, conversational, almost lazy. Miss Forbes froze for a fraction of a second, adjusting a stocking on the tree, her hand lingering just a little too long over the fabric. Hamish noted it, inwardly satisfied. The trap was weaving itself in the most delicate of threads. He wandered closer to the tree under the pretense of inspecting a loose ornament, bending slightly as if distracted. Towser sniffed at the base of the tree, his nose brushing against the stocking. Hamish murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Funny how certain scents seemed to linger. Perfume, tea, even the faintest touch of wool. He glanced at Miss Forbes out of the corner of his eye, watching for the moment her carefully maintained composure faltered. And it came. A small exhale, barely audible, and the slight shifting of weight as if she were trying to appear busy but could. Hamish smiled inwardly. Subtle pressure, carefully applied, had caused a reaction. Miss Forbes had acted near the tree, moved the parcel, and now, despite her best efforts, the smallest nudge had loosened her veneer. Hamish allowed her a moment before speaking again, casual, conversational, almost as if he had forgotten her presence. "You know, sometimes people think their careful steps go unnoticed," he said softly, letting his words drift over the room. "But the smallest things, where hands linger, how someone moves a package, even the faintest scent on a sleeve, tend to speak louder than we imagine." Miss Forbes' hands froze again. She glanced toward the lobby door, toward Blair still shouting at James, then back to Hamish. The colour drained slightly from her face, and she fidgeted with the hem of her apron. I don't know what you mean," she said, voice tight but trembling. Hamish inclined his head slowly, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. Well, that's probably for the best. But people tend to reveal themselves in their own ways. It's rarely the big actions that matter most. It's the little ones." His eyes, calm yet piercing, held hers. Towser gave a low, expectant whine, and Hamish noted how even the dog seemed to sense the tension coiling in the room. The housekeeper shifted again, and this time Hamish let his patience press just enough. "Miss Forbes," he said quietly, leaning forward slightly, "sometimes a moment of honesty can save a person much worry later. Wouldn't you rather just tell me what really happened yesterday, before anyone else guesses wrong?" Her eyes darted toward Blair, whose booming voice continued to dominate the lobby, and then back at Hamish. She swallowed hard, then exhaled sharply, a small, almost imperceptible shudder passing through her. "It was me," she admitted, voice barely audible. I didn't mean... She insulted us all the time. She thought we were beneath her. I just wanted to make her feel what she had made us." "Feel?" I moved the parcel, adjusted the stocking. "I didn't mean for her to fall." Hamish nodded, letting the confession settle. Towser nudged his leg, as if approving the careful patience that had brought the truth to light. He leaned back against the wall, giving her a moment to collect herself, and spoke softly, almost indulgently. It's done now. The truth's out, and it doesn't need to be shouted over, does it?" The tension in the room slowly eased, though the atmosphere remained taut with the awareness that the hidden motive, pride, irritation, and a desire for petty retribution, had been revealed. Hamish knew Blair would be furious to learn that the obvious suspect, James MacGregor, was innocent, but that was part of the art. Let the loud, impatient inspector take the credit and shout at shadows. Hamish had solved the puzzle quietly, subtly, with patience and observation. By late afternoon, Hamish had ensured the hotel staff understood their own roles in the disclosure. He allowed Blair to storm around the lobby, pointing fingers, dictating reports, and assuming authority over the arrest that would soon take place. Hamish remained quiet, watching, sipping coffee, and letting Towser curl at his feet. Outside, the wind had grown sharper, gusting down the narrow streets, carrying with it the chill of approaching evening. The loch reflected the grey skies, restless and unsettled, much like the village itself in the wake of revelation. Hamish had prepared carefully. The trap had revealed the killer, the hidden motive was now understood, and all that remained was the final step, ensuring the arrest, maintaining the peace, and letting Blair take the outward credit, while Hamish retained the quiet satisfaction of knowing the case had been solved through his subtle genius, rather than loud, blustering force. The villagers, oblivious to the delicate orchestration, would gossip endlessly, and the hotel would return to its routines. But the truth was now firmly in. Towser let out a soft sigh, almost imperceptible, and Hamish smiled inwardly. The hardest part of the work, observation, manipulation, psychological subtlety, was complete. Now it was simply a matter of allowing the final act to unfold, letting the human tendency toward error complete the story, while he remained quietly in the background, coffee in hand, patient and content. The evening descended over Whodunit like a heavy woolen cloak, rain drumming persistently against the cobblestones, and wind whistling through the gaps in the old village roofs. Hamish walked slowly toward the hotel, coffee thermos tucked under one arm, Towser padding at his side, ears alert to the slightest sound. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional flicker of lantern light and the faint rustle of a cat scuttling across a rooftop. Inside, the hotel lobby was bathed in the warm glow of lamps, yet the tension was palpable. Miss Forbes moved with careful precision, arranging ornaments and adjusting the Christmas tree, though her earlier confession had left a faint shadow of anxiety in her posture. Blair, predictably, had stationed himself near the reception desk, pacing like a man possessed, gesturing dramatically at the porter and muttering loudly about incompetence. Hamish leaned casually against a pillar, taking slow sips of coffee, observing everything with the patience only a Highland policeman could summon. The trap had been set, subtle comments, deliberate hints, and patient observation had teased the truth from Miss Forbes. Yet she still did not fully realise the extent of what had been uncovered. Hamish let Towser circle the base of the Christmas tree, sniffing at the stockings and the parcel once more, creating a natural pretext for observation. He let the housekeeper notice his interest, allowing her to fidget slightly, her eyes darting between him, the tree, and the misplaced package. He murmured casually, as if distracted by the ornament above his head. "Funny, isn't it? How the smallest things can make the biggest difference." His tone was light, almost conversational, but every word was intended to press gently, without direct accusation, giving Miss Forbes the illusion of control while nudging her toward a mistake. It did not take long, a tiny tremor in her hands as she adjusted a garland, a breath she did not intend to release, and the faintest flush across her cheeks betrayed that the pressure of observation was beginning to weigh. Hamish sipped his coffee, Towser letting out a small, approving grunt, and he allowed a moment to let the tension build naturally. The beauty of subtlety, he thought, was that the guilty reveal themselves entirely on their own. "Quite a busy day, isn't it?" he said aloud, his gaze lingering lightly on her. "So many details to manage, and the small things, often overlooked, sometimes carry more weight than we imagine." He leaned slightly on the pillar, Towser nuzzling against his boot. People think they can move unnoticed. Yet, it's amazing what the eyes are drawn to. Miss Forbes's hands stilled, and she shifted nervously. I only moved the parcel," she whispered, voice tight, eyes flicking toward Blair and then back to Hamish. I didn't think it would. I didn't mean for anything to happen." Hamish nodded, letting the words linger. Well, small actions often have consequences larger than intended. That's the way of things." His tone was calm, almost indulgent, yet every word carried the weight of quiet understanding. Towser circled her boots again, nudging the air between them with a quiet expectation that added just enough pressure. A moment later, she exhaled sharply, as if finally releasing the last of her carefully maintained composure. It was my fault," she admitted more fully, the confession spilling out in fragments. She belittled us, the Sassenach, always looking down, always insulting. I thought, if I moved the parcel, adjusted the stocking just a little, she'd feel some of what she put us through. I didn't know it would end like this." Her hands shook slightly, betraying the residual panic. Hamish nodded again, Towser sitting quietly at his side. That's clear now. The intention was there, though not the outcome, but understanding the why. That's the important part, and now we can make it right without harming anyone else unnecessarily." He let the silence stretch, giving her time to absorb that acknowledgement without further pressure. Blair, meanwhile, remained oblivious in the lobby, pointing fingers and shouting about the porter, convinced that the case was nearly solved. Hamish let him continue, allowing the inspector to build the drama for the villagers' benefit while he, in quiet contrast, had already unravelled the truth. There was a satisfaction in the quiet, methodical revelation that Blair could never understand, and Hamish allowed himself a small private smile. As the evening deepened, Hamish guided the situation subtly toward resolution. He spoke quietly to the hotel staff, confirming minor details and ensuring that everyone understood the sequence of events in a way that was factual but gentle, avoiding blame beyond what had been revealed. The housekeeper, visibly relieved to have confessed in the calm presence of someone who understood, began to relax, though the residual fear of social repercussion lingered in her posture. Towser gave a low, approving whine, and Hamish set down his coffee, letting the dog sit comfortably at his feet. Outside, the wind moaned around corners, carrying the chill of the loch into the village streets, while inside the hotel, warmth and light provided a sharp contrast to the grey, restless evening. Hamish surveyed the room one last time, noting the small exchanges of glances, the subtle adjustments of posture, and the easing of tension among the staff. Every detail confirmed the careful orchestration he had employed. Observation, patience, and psychological subtlety had drawn the truth to light without need for confrontation, and Blair, predictably, would take the outward credit. Hamish allowed himself a slow, satisfied sip of coffee, noting how the housekeeper now moved with a tentative but honest air, Towser following each of her steps with a curious, approving gaze. The Sassenach's death had revealed much about human nature, and the petty, quiet motivations that could escalate into tragedy. Hamish had discovered not only the actions but the subtle, personal reasons behind them, and he knew the final resolution would be handled with discretion and care. As darkness fell and the village lights began to twinkle across the wet streets, Hamish leaned against the pillar, Towser resting at his feet. The trap had succeeded, the motive had been uncovered, and the guilty party was now exposed. Blair would inevitably claim the triumph, but Hamish did not mind. The satisfaction of a case solved through quiet, meticulous attention to detail was far sweeter than any promotion or public recognition. The village of Whodunit could now settle back into its rhythms, the story of the Sassenach's demise fully understood by those who needed to know, while the rest would gossip endlessly, as they always did. Hamish allowed his mind a rare moment of peace, letting the wind outside the windows and the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof underscore the quiet victory. Towser gave a small, contented sigh, resting his head on Hamish's boot, and Hamish let himself smile, thinking of the warm cup of coffee waiting at home, and the simple comfort of the village he protected, quietly in his own unassuming way. The day's work was nearly done, and soon the arrest would take place, neat in the public eye but carefully arranged, leaving Hamish to enjoy the satisfaction of solving the case while remaining under the radar, in his beloved Whodunit, where subtlety and patience were more powerful than noise and fury. The next morning arrived, damp and wind-whipped, the loch restless under a sky heavy with slate-coloured clouds. Hamish walked slowly through the village, Towser padding quietly at his side, ears twitching at the faintest sounds, the creak of shutters, the slap of boots on wet cobbles, the distant bark of a dog. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere had shifted, staff moved with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The confession of Miss Forbes the previous evening had set things in motion, though Blair remained blissfully unaware of the subtleties that had led Hamish to the truth. Blair, predictably, had claimed the morning to orchestrate the arrest. He was pacing the lobby, shouting instructions at the porter, waving papers, and dictating triumphantly into the telephone. "Yes, absolutely. The culprit has been identified. Our efforts have succeeded. MacGregor was... No matter. Details will be clarified." Hamish leaned against the stone pillar by the entrance, coffee in hand, Towser at his feet, and watched with a quiet amusement. The inspector's bluster provided excellent cover for the delicate proceedings about to unfold. Miss Forbes moved nervously near the Christmas tree, adjusting ornaments, her hands trembling slightly. She knew the truth was out, though the precise orchestration of events by Hamish remained invisible to her. He approached casually, pretending distraction, while Towser sniffed at the base of the tree, nudging gently. "Aye, busy morning," Hamish murmured. "So many things to attend to, yet one must move carefully. Even the smallest misstep can draw attention." Her eyes flicked up at him, wide and anxious. Hamish allowed a moment to let the tension grow, then let his voice soften almost indulgently. "Miss Forbes, it seems we both understand what happened yesterday, and now, perhaps, it is time to let others see the outcome as well. There is no need for further worry. The important thing is that the truth is known." Her hands shook, and she exhaled sharply. The subtle trap Hamish had woven, the careful hints, the casual observations, the patient patience, had done its work. She had revealed herself quietly, without drama, and now the final steps were merely procedural. Hamish allowed her a faint, reassuring nod, letting her understand that all would be managed. Blair, oblivious to the subtlety of the confession, barked orders toward the porter. "Step aside, MacGregor. This is our moment. We will secure justice. Stand back, everyone. The arrest is at hand." His chest was red, voice booming, while staff and villagers watching from windows craned necks in anticipation. Hamish, as usual, remained in the background, letting the inspector play the part of authority. Towser nudged his leg gently, and Hamish bent slightly to whisper, "All in place, boy. Just as planned." Then, stepping forward casually, he addressed Miss Forbes softly. "Now, perhaps it is best to go with the flow, Let the others see without further complication." She nodded faintly, understanding the cue without question. Blair lunged forward, a triumphant roar on his lips, and formally arrested the housekeeper, who complied, her face pale but relieved that the truth had been acknowledged, and no one would speculate beyond what Hamish allowed. He followed at a casual pace, Towser at his side, ensuring her movements were steady, while Blair bellowed for the cameras of imagination, imagined or real, depending on the staff's imagination, how he had solved the case with impeccable insight. Hamish allowed a small, private smile. The case was concluded, the true motive revealed, and the red herring maintained for public appearances. Miss Forbes had acted out of pride, irritation, and a desire for subtle revenge against the Sassenach's constant condescension. Nothing more elaborate was necessary, and Blair, none the wiser, would claim the glory and the narrative of authority, while Hamish maintained the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. By late afternoon, the arrest was formalized, statements taken, and the hotel staff exhaled collectively, the tension lifting slightly. Towser settled at Hamish's feet, his tail sweeping softly against the carpet, and Hamish allowed himself a slow sip of coffee, observing the relief in the villagers' eyes. The Sassenach's death had left its mark, yet justice, subtle and precise, had been served. Hamish walked outside to the village square, the rain having lessened to a gentle drizzle. The loch mirrored the grey clouds, small ripples disturbed by the wind, and the mountains loomed like silent witnesses. Villagers went about their business, some peering curiously at the hotel, others discussing the arrest in hushed tones. Hamish felt the familiar sense of satisfaction settle deep in his chest. The village was safe, the guilty party acknowledged, and the delicate balance of Highland life could resume. Towser nudged his hand, and Hamish patted him, glancing toward the hotel with a faint smile. Blair would leave soon, reports filed with Strathbane, and the inspector's bluster would be remembered as heroic by the unobservant, while Hamish enjoyed the quiet knowledge that the case had been solved by subtle observation, intuition, and patience. He had manipulated events without overt interference, ensured the truth surfaced, and preserved his own preferred obscurity. By evening, the village had returned to its slow rhythm. Shops closed, smoke drifted from chimneys, and the occasional lamp flickered in windows, creating golden pools against the grey streets. Hamish returned home, Towser padding beside him, and made himself a proper cup of coffee, savouring the warmth and comfort. He allowed the aroma to fill the small kitchen, listening to the soft patter of remaining raindrops against the window. Outside, the wind hummed low through the mountains, carrying with it the familiar scent of loch water and pine, grounding him in the village he had protected and loved for so long. He settled into his chair, Towser, curling at his feet, and let himself enjoy the calm after the storm. The Sassenach's intrusion, the murder, the tension, and the confession were all behind him now. Blair would take the credit, the villagers would gossip endlessly, and the hotel would return to routine. Hamish, content and unremarkable in the eyes of the world, had achieved exactly what he intended, the truth revealed, justice done, and his beloved Whodunit, untouched by the chaos that outsiders brought, and as the evening deepened into night. Hamish sipped his coffee, Towser snoring softly, the loch reflecting the dim lights of the village, and he allowed himself a rare smile of satisfaction. Peace had returned to Whodunit, quiet and careful, just as it should be, with Hamish Macbeth observing, knowing, and content in the simple rhythm of Highland life. The days after the arrest settled over Whodunit with a gentle rhythm, as if the village itself had exhaled in relief. Snow had begun to fall lightly on the hills, softening the edges of stone walls and rooftops, and the loch lay calm beneath a pale winter sun. Hamish walked slowly through the village streets, Towser padding faithfully at his side, ears flicking at the smallest sounds. the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant call of a gull, the soft murmur of villagers going about errands. There was an almost tangible sense of normalcy returning, though the Sassenach's absence and the revelation of Miss Forbes's actions had left a subtle imprint on the collective consciousness. The housekeeper moved about the hotel quietly, carrying out her duties with the measured humility of someone who had learned a hard lesson. Blair had departed for Strathbane, already boasting to anyone who would listen of the swift and decisive capture of the culprit, unaware that the true orchestration had been handled entirely by the unassuming local policeman in the corner. The porter, James MacGregor, now free of suspicion, went about his work with a faint spring in his step, his own relief unspoken but palpable. Hamish, as always, remained content in his quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice had been done without spectacle or exaggeration. The village had resumed its usual rhythm, the small dramas and minor irritations of Highland life filling the spaces left by the Sassenach's intrusion. Hamish visited the post office, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Grant, and noting with mild amusement how gossip travelled faster than the winter wind. At the curry shop, Mr. Singh shook his head over a pot of warming stew, muttering about the extraordinary events, while Hamish sipped coffee and allowed the conversation to drift in directions that revealed nothing, yet confirmed everything. People's habits, the flicker of glances, the tiny hesitations, all spoke volumes to Hamish, though to anyone else they seemed trivial or mundane. Priscilla Halberton Smythe had stopped by for a brief visit, bringing with her a parcel of shortbread and a polite inquiry about Hamish's well-being. The brief exchange, warm and lightly teasing, reminded him that life, even in the midst of murder, intrigue and village scandal, continued, with the quiet rhythms of affection, subtle companionship and human connection. Elspeth Grant had left a small note tucked under the door of the police station, offering tea and conversation at a later time, a subtle acknowledgement of their ongoing friendship and collaboration. Hamish smiled at the thought, setting aside the small complexities of romantic entanglements for another day. By the afternoon, Hamish had returned to his small house, Towser stretching at his feet, the kettle whistling softly on the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his favourite chair, glancing out the window at the snow settling gently on the hills and the loch reflecting pale winter light. There was a satisfaction in routine, in quiet observation, in the knowledge that chaos had been met with patience and subtlety rather than bluster. Blair might take the credit, the village might gossip endlessly, but the truth, the quiet, meticulous truth, rested securely with Hamish Macbeth. Towser let out a soft sigh and curled against Hamish's boots, and the detective leaned back with a small smile, savouring the warmth of the room and the calm of the winter afternoon. The case had been solved, the hidden motives revealed, and the equilibrium of Whodunit restored. The villagers would continue with their lives. The gossip would spin itself in endless loops, and Hamish would remain quietly, deliberately unremarkable, content in the knowledge that his methods, patience, observation and understanding of human nature, had preserved both justice and the village's peace. Outside, the wind whispered through the hills, stirring the loose snow on the rooftops, carrying a faint scent of pine and the loch. Inside, the small, comforting routines of home and coffee, of fire and warmth, and the faithful presence of Towser at his side reminded Hamish why he stayed in Whodunit. It was not the glory, nor the promotions, nor the recognition that mattered. It was the simple, steady rhythm of life, the quiet victories, and the knowledge that subtlety often outmatched spectacle. Hamish sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him, listening to the faint creak of the house settling and the distant murmur of the village returning to its normal pace. Justice had been served, the truth had been uncovered, and the village remained intact. He smiled faintly at Towser, who lifted his head in response, eyes bright and knowing, as if to say, "All in a day's work, Hamish." And with that, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself the rare luxury of pure contentment, the case closed, the village quiet, and his beloved Highlands stretching endlessly beyond the windows, waiting for the next quiet mystery that would require neither bluster nor spectacle, only patience, observation, and a steady cup of coffee. Whodunit was peaceful once, more